Welcome to the introductory lecture on breathing is the key. Today we're going to go over a few topics, just introducing everyone to how we're looking at breathing, a new way of looking at it that's based on, it's not all that new, but probably in the late 1990s there was a introduction of certain technology that allowed better functional measurements of breathing. And what we're hoping to do at Physical is bring that technology into daily use in some clinics, but also use that technology called capnography to educate each other on some of the components of breathing that can enhance performance. This is a technology that not the technology, but the breathing techniques are something that we can use every day in our clinic to enhance performance, treat people with chronic conditions related to balance disorders, dizziness, orthopedic, chronic pain, trigger points, breathing difficulties. It impacts all of these different facets of physical therapy. And although breathing is utilized in physical therapy, many of us use mindfulness kinds of techniques or encourage people with yoga techniques. My personal experience is that I'm one of those people, is that my understanding of breathing really was not comprehensive and didn't include an understanding of the basic biology. So I'm going to just try in this introductory lecture just to give a brief introduction. I'm not going to try to go into too much detail. But again, these are interventions that can help with sports performance, anxiety, depression, balance, respiratory disease, orthopedic chronic pain, concussions, etc. So here I'm going to be sharing my talk with some slides. This is the basic outline of what we're doing today. What are the conditions you would see in clinic related to breathing. I want to explain the function of the pulmonary system, not in too much detail, but enough of a taste of what this is about that you can get oriented to our later, more detailed lectures. Specifically, how oxygen and carbon dioxide have to be balanced out in how we use our lungs to balance the oxygen and CO2 levels in our blood. My basic understanding is that we take big breaths in and oxygenate our blood, and we blow out waste products, carbon dioxide, and that's absolutely incorrect. Thought that was correct, kind of knew it wasn't correct, but I was confused. So I want to introduce how to optimize oxygen and CO2 exchange. And we'll go over a brief introduction to the mechanism of acid balance in the blood and why this is important to how oxygen is utilized throughout our body. So this is just an introduction to optimizing breathing to address everything from sports performance to the everyday frustrating things, chronic conditions we see in our clinic. So let me give a little personal introduction. Hi, my name is Herb. I'm an overbreather. What does that mean, an overbreather? How do I find out about it? How do I learn about it? What did I do about it? And how did it affect me? Well, I was interested in my own breathing. I'm an overbreather when I run. My heart rate goes up too much. I'm breathless when I run. I've run for decades. I'm 64 years old, and my running just wasn't right. A year ago, I decided to sort of look into this, went back to all the yoga things I learned in the 70s, Kundalini yoga, Kriya yoga, breath of fire, big breathing techniques, things in mindfulness. My undergraduate degree in psychology, we did everything that later became mindfulness. We were doing EEGs of the brain. We were doing breathing techniques. We were doing yoga, Tai Chi, did a lot of things. And so I had that resource to go back to. And I was very confused. What happened was COVID and the quarantine, and I was introduced to, first off, John Nestor's book, Breath. It came out right as, if you were looking up COVID breathing things, you sort of started seeing things about breath that were new. John Nestor wrote a book, quite popular, explains a lot of the confusion that we have. Oxygen Vantage, Patrick McCune, he studied with a famous Russian physician, Buteyko. I'm probably not saying that right, but Dr. Buteyko realized that he was going to die if he didn't. He was going to die. His blood pressure was 220 over 160, something incredible like that. In the 1940s, they knew nothing of how to treat that, and people just died in a few years, and he'd come to accept that. But he treated people, and he realized his breathing was off. He developed a well-researched for the time methodology for treating that Buteyko method. Patrick McCune went and studied with him in the 90s. Patrick McCune works with children to enhance their breathing, works with asthmatics, but he also works a lot with professional athletes. And he's brought a lot to the new science of breathing. Conscious breathing, Anders Olsen, he's in the book Breath, and he has introduced a lot of these concepts as well. So there's a lot in the popular press that we can expose ourselves to, but there's also a lot of scientific literature. Sort of where the basics of what we're doing and the measurements. The thing that was interesting to me was that we didn't have a practical way of measuring our breath to find out what's the ideal concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide in our blood. We're all doing pulse oximetry now when people come into the clinic, and I've known for years that your blood was fully oxygenated. And when you go to a yoga class and they say, take a deep breath and oxygenate your blood, I knew that was incorrect. I knew that athletes that blood doping, the way to get more oxygen into your blood is to go to higher altitudes, increase your red blood cell count, or just take your blood out and get your own packed red blood cells. And if you put more red blood cells in, you get more oxygen. So that's what those were the ideas, but you still couldn't measure it, and there wasn't a practical way of knowing whether you were enhancing your oxygenation of your blood, except for capnography. And the earliest I see it mentioned is this article from 1996, and they actually did normative data. They do a lot about the symptoms associated with poor ventilation, hyperventilation, overbreathing. And capnography actually helps you measure CO2 levels, which I'll explain in a moment about how that works and why that's important. But there's lots of literature on this. This isn't like from a few books in the popular press. Physical Zone, Denise Campbell has been working with this. She's one of the pioneers. She's been working with this for 15 years and measuring CO2 levels and seeing the effects it has on her population of patients. So we have a pioneer that we'll be introducing to you, along with the popular press. She's been way ahead of the curve on this. So some of those symptoms, here's a list. You can just go through it. Everything you see in clinic that frustrates you is on this list. It goes on to a second page. I'm not going to go through this. I just want you to I want you to see that these are the things that have been identified as being problematic with poor oxygenation of your blood, which isn't increasing your oxygen, but as I'll explain in a moment, is actually retaining CO2 in your blood to allow oxygenation of the peripheral tissues, your muscles, your or digestive organs, or all your organs, actually, your heart, and getting blood into your brain. So when we talk about the muscles, one of the things we know from study of trigger points is that the trigger points are hypoxic. And that's part of my doctorate. I did a study on trigger points as part of my doctorate. And what we learned is that along with being hypoxic, a trigger point has all these chemicals in it that are acidic. And that trigger point is actually too acidic, and blood flow is blocked off, and it's hypoxic. My thinking was the problem is all these acidic chemicals led to the hypoxia. I mean, it was always baffling to me is how you could have a capillary that I know was fully oxygenated from doing pulse oximetry. I knew people had good oxygenation of their blood, but right next to that capillary with oxygen, you have a hypoxic trigger point. So my thinking now is that actually the hypoxia is the problem, and because of the poor circulation that results, we end up with all these chemicals, metabolites that we don't want in the muscle in it, and they're also acidic. And when we talk in a minute about how carbon dioxide helps release oxygen from the red blood cell to get into the muscle, it'll make more sense. We also have brain scans. This is from the Amen clinics, and they show a healthy brain, and then they show brains with different pathology. Here's post-traumatic stress, and what you're seeing is different areas of the brain due to different pathologies, traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress in this slide results in different areas of the brain lacking oxygen, being hypoxic. You can actually change the oxygenation of your blood within a minute by hyperventilating. Blowing off carbon dioxide will decrease carbon dioxide in your blood. The red blood cell will remain really firmly attached. The oxygen will remain really firmly attached to the red blood cell, and hence you'll just be, you'll have oxygen in the blood, but you won't have it in your brain. That's what we're coming up to discuss in just a moment. But here's just two examples of the brain is hypoxic with certain conditions, trauma, a lot of things we see in clinic, and we know that the muscles are hypoxic, and we want to solve that problem. So what is the problem with our breathing? So this is the basic premise for our breathing is the key. As a result of physical or psychological trauma, breathing is altered. This alteration leads to hypocapnia, or a decrease in CO2 in the blood. A decrease in CO2 in the blood. That hypocapnia is a problem. Low levels of CO2 in the blood. I'm going to explain why we know that's a problem and how we measure it and how we correct it. The reduced CO2 in the blood results in poor oxygen transport into the muscles, organs, brain. This is a graph from, or this graph actually is from 1904, the Bohr effect. And in human physiology, all of us were exposed to the Bohr effect. We learned about oxygen dissociation from the red blood cell. We learned that when we exercise and we heat up muscles, that encourages heating the blood results in a release of oxygen from the red blood cell to get into the muscle. So when you exercise and you warm things up, you get more oxygen in the blood. We also learned that the acidity of the blood, the more acidic, that's what the oxygen dissociation curve here is describing is that when the blood becomes more acidic, oxygen is released. And there is an ideal level of acidity, and we learned that, we memorized it, been known since 1904, but since there isn't any way of measuring it clinically, functionally, we never have used this in the clinic until the capnograph, which I mentioned a moment ago. So a little bit easier graph to look at is this one. And this is showing that when you have, when you change the acidity without CO2 and then CO2 is present, even changing the acidity makes a slight difference, but the presence in this red line, when CO2 is incorporated into the blood to make the blood more acidic, dropping the pH to 7.2 in this example, as you make it more acidic, not only do you making the blood more acidic, this line here is the blood is at a pH of 7.2. Here the blood is at 7.2 as well, but there's the addition of CO2. CO2 does two things. It makes the blood more acidic, but it also, just the presence of CO2 allows for the blood to disassociate from the oxygen. Whoops. The presence of CO2 allows the oxygen to disassociate from the hemoglobin. That's the Bohr effect. So there is an ideal level of CO2 that we want in our blood, and we can measure that with capnography. The article I showed you from 1996, they established norms, and you can measure it with exhale using a cannula. You can measure the CO2 levels, know what it is if you want to go that route. There's also other, what I call functional tests, that are various ways of measuring breath holding time. And by measuring, it's not just taking a breath and holding it as long as you can. There's a structure to it that you use in clinic. It will explain. But you can use that as well to get a baseline function. And it tells you what someone's sensitivity to CO2 level is. CO2 is actually the trigger for us to breathe. If I hold my breath, sit here for a while, and we'll show this in our later courses, lectures, will show that your CO2 starts to go up, and your oxygen saturation doesn't change that much. And the signal to breathe is when your CO2 goes up to a certain level. When everything's working right, you're perfectly comfortable with high levels of CO2, sufficiently high levels of CO2 in your blood to get this ideal disassociation of the oxygen from the hemoglobin into your brain, into your muscle. You're comfortable with that level. But after trauma, both physical and psychological, humans tend to alter their breathing. Animals don't. They don't. It's just a story. Humans have this ability. We have this ability where we alter our breathing. And we pathologically overbreathe. Overbreathing is breathing off too much CO2. And like I said, I'm an overbreather. I'm still an overbreather, but I'm much less of one than I used to be a year ago. What we do is we tend to blow off too much carbon dioxide, and our sensors in our brainstem become acclimated to the lower levels of carbon dioxide, meaning that we take breaths too soon, diluting the carbon dioxide in our lungs and changing the CO2 acid balance in our blood, resulting in the oxygen sticking to the hemoglobin and not getting it where we would like it to go. Of course, we get oxygen from our lungs, goes to our red blood cells, attaches to the hemoglobin, and in the presence of CO2, we release it. Without enough CO2, all that good oxygen goes to waste. The other interesting thing that one of my patients said today is, don't forget the weight loss component. You need oxygen in the muscle to burn fat. You want to change over from burning glucose to burning fat. You have to have oxygen in the muscle to do that. Many of us don't do it efficiently. We can exercise inefficiently and not lose the weight like we would if we had a good oxygenation of our muscles. So just a little show and tell here. I'm going to hopefully I can stop sharing my screen. And hopefully what I want to do is I want to show you a little bit of the magic that takes place in our lungs. I call it magic. We got an atmosphere out here, and we have certain levels. I'm going to go over this in a later lecture, the exact, what's the pressure of oxygen, CO2, nitrogen in the atmosphere, and how we want to build our own atmosphere in our lungs. That's actually what we're after, is changing the atmosphere in our lung by adjusting our breathing, not diluting the air in here with atmospheric air, but controlling how we're breathing so we can capture CO2 in our lungs. And basically, we're all familiar with diaphragmatic breathing. We want to breathe with our diaphragm, but we don't want to take big tidal breaths. We want to do light breathing. We want it to be slow. We want the breath to go deep, like I said. And we want to incorporate what we call east-west breathing as well as diaphragmatic breathing. We want to use our diaphragm, but we also want to use our ribs. We want to make sure that people's ribs are expanding. And it's a light breath. It's not a big, I just sucked in a lot of air that has not nearly the amount of carbon dioxide that we would like for ideal function. So I diluted what was in my lungs. I diluted the carbon dioxide. So we take light breaths and light exhales. And there's a certain amount of, there's certain ratios that you can work with. And then there's measures you can tell whether the technique you're using is working clinically. There's also laboratory tools like the capnograph that you can use in clinic that give you a really spot on kind of measure. So we have these options, and that's the basic introduction of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be going through just the basic terminology. There's the words that we use to describe the volume of air in our lungs and the ratios of oxygen and carbon dioxide. There's some basic science, quite a bit, and then we're going to go into how to apply it clinically, how to use it, and how we've been using it, the results we've seen with our clients. And I guarantee this is going to take patient care to a whole new level just by adding an additional modality to your typical interventions. And that's the introduction of breathing is the key that we're using here at Physical, and we're excited about it. We're looking forward to your participation, and thank you for your time.